We've been talking the last few weeks about Bodaisatta Shishobo, this text on the four methods of the bodhisattva. And we talked about giving, we talked about loving speech, about benefit action, and then last week we started talking about identity action. And I think tonight we probably come to the end. There's just a little bit more to say. It occurs to me, and maybe it occurs to you as well, that if you understand giving, if you understand loving speech, if you understand benefit action, in a broad sense we can say that you understand Buddhism. If you understand identity action, I would say you understand Zen. It's in its own category. It's so simple. And yet, we make it elusive. It becomes a kind of mind trap. Trying to find this thing, trying to create this thing that feels like what we think it should feel like. I'll dive back into Dogen here. Dogen, as we were reading last week, he's describing identity action, and he's talking about how heavenly beings befriend heavenly beings and spirits befriend spirits. And he says, this is how we study identity action. And then he says, for example, action means form, dignity, attitude. He's not redefining anything. He's actually defining the character, gyo, which we've talked about quite a bit. It's action, but it's, in a Zen context, it has to do with action within the Dharma. And the mind trap to start is that we imagine that there's something out there that is gyo and something that is not. We drop that. It's form, it's dignity, it's attitude, it's what we're doing. And we need to pause here to understand when identity action. When I first heard about identity action, I heard a very good description about how, when you're performing an action, when you're doing something, you're kind of one with that action. Right? And we hear this all the time, when you're washing the dishes, you're just washing the dishes. When you're walking, you're just walking. These are beautiful. But it's just a hair's breadth away from this idea that I, from where I am, can choose to be one with something. Right? There's the old joke, right? The monk goes to the hot dog vendor and says, "Make me one with everything." We have fallen back for decades on this idea that Buddhism has to do with this oneness, and that this oneness is something we establish, or it's something we recognize. And in talking that way, we just further dig the hole of duality. Right? Here I am, there's an action, I'm going to go ahead and bond with that action and become one with that. And now I've made a little bubble around me and that. So we have to be cautious about this idea of oneness. We have to be cautious about what it means to identify with something. And so Dogen begins by saying action means form. It means dignity. So it starts with how you're holding yourself. Not necessarily how you're holding something else, not necessarily the relationship that you imagine you might have with that something else. That's beyond your control. He then says, after letting others identify with our self, there may be a principle of letting our self identify with others. Relations between self and others vary infinitely depending on time and condition. Okay? He's saying this identification is complicated. And then he says, Guanji says, the ocean does not refuse water. Therefore, it is able to achieve vastness. Mountains do not refuse earth. Therefore, they are able to become tall. Wise rulers do not weary of people. Therefore, they form a large nation. There's something almost passive about it. It isn't that I'm trying to, when I do the dishes, we just do the dishes. There's this kind of contraction you can do around the dishes, where now I'm going to throw myself spiritually into dishwashing, right? In order to make it something. That's not what this is. He's taking something like the ocean and he's saying, ocean doesn't push the water away. An ocean is water. Ocean has no rejection of that. Mountains don't refuse earth. A mountain is earth. And he says, wise rulers do not become weary of people. Because rulers are the people. Without the people, you're not a ruler. They define one another. In this practice, and we've talked about this over and over and over again for years now, the question arises, what is it that defines me? If an ocean is water, if a mountain is earth, what am I? If I know that I am impermanent, if I know that I don't have this inherent self, if I am constantly changing, if I am dependent on other factors, what is it that is me in the same way that water is ocean? And what it comes down to is, it's what you're doing right now. Any other possible answer to that is a story. But this is not a story. You sitting right now, you listening right now, you breathing right now, your heart beating right now is not a story about who you are. It's who you are. And so, in order to understand identity action, in order to know what Dogen is talking about, we have to look at our relationship to that. The relationship to what I'm doing right now, whatever that is. And the question around it always is, am I pushing or am I pulling? Or neither? If I'm pushing, there's something about what I'm doing right now that I don't want to identify with. Or I want it to be something else. I want it to be less. I want it to be more. If I'm pulling, there's something I'm trying to get from it that is beyond what it is already. There is a tendency within this tradition to kind of turn everything back to Zazen. Right? Zazen is the example of everything. And sometimes I try to resist doing that. because we can come to the conclusion that Zazen is a panacea. That it's where we go when something is broken. That's not it. But here, in this conversation, it is very useful because we just did it. We just sat here in silence. And you can watch what that is. You can watch what your relationship to that is, and you can see how so much of your experience, and I think I'm speaking to everybody, first of all, is pushing. Sitting but thinking, I have 10 other things I could be doing. Or I have that thing I don't want to forget. Or this is fine, but I wish he would ring the bell. Right? There's some motion like this. We're keeping it at bay so that I am doing that. They're separate. And then the other thing we do during that time when we're sitting here and we're breathing is we pull. And what that often looks like is that we're trying to make Zazen into something. Most often what we're doing is we're trying to spiritualize it. Which sounds funny because isn't it a spiritual practice? Not exactly. So we sit down and we think, okay, it's me and all beings. And emptiness. Let's go. Right? Or we say, this is what my teacher did, and what my teacher's teacher did, and what my teacher's teacher's teacher did, and now I'm sitting in that space. We say, this is the activity of letting fall away body and mind. And I'm doing that. And in this way, we pull it very, very close. And we make it really small because we're holding it just like this. You can go through not just one period of Zazen, but a lifetime of Zazen, bouncing back and forth between these two activities. We push and we pull, and we push and we pull. And that's fine, because we're human. But occasionally, maybe because we're tired, maybe because we've been sitting for a long time, we forget to push and we forget to pull, and we have a few moments in which we're just sitting here and we're breathing. And we're not trying to go somewhere else, and we're not trying to create something here. We're doing the activity of Zazen, and we're doing nothing more than that. I don't say all this to give you a complex, because we all already have it, about what this is supposed to feel like, what shape it's supposed to take, but to point out, you've probably had this experience. You probably know what this feels like, and you probably also know what it feels like to notice it and then actually choose to go back to pushing and pulling. Because that fantasy you had earlier was really good. And you let go of it for a few minutes, but then, oh yeah, I could go back to that. It's difficult to stay in just this. It's very, very hard to be still. Dogen says that the ocean does not refuse water is identity action. We should also know that the virtue of water does not refuse the ocean. He's saying this goes both ways. It isn't you as protagonist. So while you're doing all the rest of this, drop that too. The idea that you're the subject of the sentence. This is why water is able to form an ocean and earth is able to form mountains. We should know in ourselves that because the ocean does not refuse to be the ocean, it can be the ocean and achieve greatness. This is not about being something more. It's about being nothing more. I'll skip down because he kind of says the same thing over and over for a while. He ends simply by saying, identity action is the practice and vow of a bodhisattva. And his last sentence is, we should simply face all beings with a gentle expression. After all that, learning about the depth of giving, about the depth of our speech, about the depth of benefit, about this whole fundamental idea in Zen of doing and being whatever you're doing and being right now. He says, just face all beings with a gentle expression. I think different commentators say different things about this, but here's what I want to say about it. Don't make a big deal out of it. Right? He doesn't end on some grand spiritual note. He doesn't end on a note of enlightenment. He doesn't end on a note of liberation. He's talking about how to be a bodhisattva. He's talking about the tools that a bodhisattva uses. And the last thing he wants to say to you is, be warm toward other people. That's all. Make that central. Don't forget that. And in the background, these other things are explored. If you just choose to carry that basic kindness into every day, you are exploring giving. You are exploring loving speech. You are exploring benefit action. You are exploring identity action. They all manifest in a way that is completely unexceptional. That has no glow about it at all. It doesn't have the fire and the noise of Zen masters shouting, hitting people. It doesn't smell like incense. It doesn't sound like a gong. It's in your eyes. What it looks like when someone smiles while they're still wearing the mask. And you know that they are. And what a generous gesture that is. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.